Emily and Jacob were just two innocent children, full of life and laughter, until the day their mother's carefully constructed story turned their world into a deadly trap. What seemed like a tragic accident would soon unravel into a chilling mystery that left an entire neighborhood questioning everything they thought they knew. The summer sun hung mercilessly over the quiet suburban neighborhood, turning the asphalt streets into a shimmering, oppressive heat. Temperatures had soared well past 100 degrees, the kind of weather that made even short walks outside exhausting and dangerous. On this particular afternoon, the peace of the community was shattered by an urgent call that would draw emergency responders into the heart of a scene no parent ever wanted to encounter. Dispatchers picked up the voice of a woman, frantic and trembling, claiming that her two young children were trapped inside a car parked in her driveway. She insisted they had been left there for hours, forgotten in the scorching heat. The call was rushed, panicked, fragmented, and full of sobs. Within minutes, police vehicles and an ambulance roared down the street. Neighbors, who had been lounging on their porches or tending gardens, now crowded behind yellow tape, whispering in shock and disbelief. Everyone knew the family. The mother, young and seemingly ordinary, had always appeared attentive, if a bit overwhelmed. Her children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 2, had often been seen playing in the yard under her watchful eyes. The sight of paramedics hurriedly opening the car doors sent a ripple of horror through the crowd. Inside, the children were unresponsive, their small bodies limp in the back seat. The heat had warped the interior, making the air inside stifling and thick. The mother was immediately at the center of attention. She clutched at her face, sobbing uncontrollably, repeatedly insisting she hadn't meant for this to happen. Her voice cracked, trembling with grief, her words barely coherent. First responders attempted to console her while carefully examining the scene, but something about her behavior struck them as unusual. She wept openly, yet her eyes seemed to dart anxiously around the perimeter, avoiding certain glances from the officers. There was a frantic energy in her movements, a tension that hinted at something more than grief. As paramedics worked on the children, trying to revive them, police officers began scanning the car and surrounding area for evidence. The doors were unlocked, the windows slightly cracked, a detail that raised questions. Why would a forgetful parent leave her children inside a car in the heat while taking such precautions? The neighborhood was a quiet one, and many residents prided themselves on their vigilance. Witnesses reported seeing the mother come and go from the house in the hours prior, moving quickly between rooms but never seeming to notice her children's absence. Some neighbors had even noticed the car earlier in the day, parked and empty, but assumed the children were inside with a parent. The sun bore down relentlessly as the scene unfolded, casting long shadows across the driveway. Detectives arrived, taking in every detail with trained eyes. Every small inconsistency, every unusual gesture, every fragment of the mother's story was mentally logged. She repeated variations of what had supposedly happened, her timeline shifting slightly each time she spoke. There were moments when her grief seemed genuine, yet in others it appeared rehearsed, calculated even. The tension was palpable, not just from the heat, but from the unspoken suspicion that began to form in the minds of those investigating. What had been called in as a tragic accident now felt like the start of a puzzle, a mystery that would demand every bit of patience, scrutiny, and skill to unravel. The first hours of the investigation were filled with meticulous questioning, observations, and the quiet hum of suspicion growing beneath the surface. Detectives began to reconstruct the events of the day, speaking to neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have insight into the family's routine. At first, the mother's story seemed straightforward. She had been busy in the house, attending to chores, and had simply forgotten the children in the car. Yet as officers pieced together her account, cracks began to appear. Her timeline was inconsistent, shifting in subtle but significant ways. She had first said she went inside to do laundry, then later mentioned running errands, and at another point claimed to have been making phone calls. Each version contradicted the others, raising questions about her credibility. Officers carefully examined the car itself, noting details that didn't match the mother's story. The windows were partially open, and the doors were unlocked, which suggested she had access to the vehicle and could have removed the children at any time. There were no signs of struggle, but the children had not been in the car long enough to show typical symptoms of prolonged heat exposure. The interior temperature, while high, did not fully account for their condition. The inconsistencies weighed heavily on the investigators' minds. They began to wonder if the woman's claim of forgetfulness was a carefully crafted explanation, meant to disguise something far more sinister. Neighbors' accounts also began to paint a puzzling picture. Some reported seeing the mother moving through the house at odd intervals, while others said they had seen the children playing in the yard earlier, only for them to disappear without explanation. Friends described her as loving but often stressed, prone to moments of distraction that seemed natural for a busy parent. Yet, even in these testimonies, detectives detected a subtle pattern of exaggeration and avoidance in her behavior. She seemed capable of projecting normalcy while concealing deeper, troubling truths. Every small detail she provided had to be measured against physical evidence and witness accounts, and the discrepancies were mounting. Forensic specialists were called in to document the car and the scene with precision. Fingerprints were cataloged, photographs were taken, and every trace of potential evidence was analyzed. Even the positions of objects in the car were noted, revealing that the children's seating arrangements did not match what the mother had described. The toys scattered across the back seat were arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement, rather than accidental abandonment. Investigators began to suspect that the scene might have been staged, created to mislead responders and mask the true sequence of events. By evening, the initial narrative of an accidental tragedy was already unraveling. Detectives felt a growing unease as they reviewed the collected evidence and re-examined the mother's statements. Something in her demeanor, the way she repeated her story with slight alterations, and the subtle contradictions in her timeline made it clear that there was more to uncover. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and each observation deepened the mystery. What had started as a desperate call about children trapped in a hot car was turning into a complex investigation, one that demanded careful scrutiny of both the evidence and the person at the center of it all. The sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air, signaling that the truth would not be simple and that the story being told might be far from reality. When the autopsy report arrived, it sent shockwaves through the investigation, confirming the growing suspicion that the children's deaths were far from accidental. The medical examiner's findings were precise, detailed, and chilling. The bodies did not display the expected signs of heat stroke or dehydration, conditions typically seen in cases where children are left in a hot car for hours. Instead, there were bruises in unusual places, subtle yet telling, and traces of a sedative in their systems. The toxicology report suggested the children had been incapacitated before being placed in the vehicle, turning what had appeared to be a tragic oversight into a potential premeditated act. The implications were horrifying, and detectives began to treat the mother not as a grieving parent, but as a potential suspect in a deliberate crime. Investigators meticulously reviewed every moment of the day, cross-referencing witness statements with forensic evidence. They examined surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses, hoping to track the mother's movements and verify her story. Small details that had seemed trivial before now took on sinister significance. The timing of her trips inside the house, her movements around the driveway, and even the way she had parked the car. Every inconsistency now carried weight, and officers felt the tension rising with each new discovery. What had once been a scene of tragic neglect was now a puzzle pointing to something far darker. The car itself was scrutinized in detail. Specialists examined fingerprints, seatbelt placement, and the arrangement of items in the back seat. The children's bodies had been positioned deliberately, their limbs arranged in ways inconsistent with a panicked struggle or accidental placement. Investigators noted the careful positioning of their clothing and belongings, suggesting that someone had gone to great lengths to make the scene appear natural, to hide the truth beneath a layer of false innocence. Each discovery chipped away at the narrative of forgetfulness, replacing it with a growing sense of orchestration. Detectives also delved into the mother's history, looking for patterns of behavior or previous incidents that might explain her actions. They found minor but significant details: past reports of neglect, unexplained absences during critical moments, and a history of manipulation in her personal relationships. While none of these alone proved guilt, combined with the forensic evidence, they painted a troubling portrait. The woman who had once been portrayed by neighbors as overworked but loving now appeared calculated, capable of masking dangerous intentions behind a facade of normalcy. As the day turned into night, the investigation reached a new intensity. Every piece of evidence, every witness account, and every detail of the autopsy pushed the case into a darker narrative. Detectives confronted the reality that the children's deaths had likely been staged, a horrific attempt to disguise murder as accident. The weight of this realization hung over the team, fueling a determination to uncover the full truth. The case had shifted from tragic to chilling, and the mother, who had called for help and claimed innocence, was now the focal point of a complex and disturbing investigation. The unraveling of her story had begun, and the detectives knew that the coming days would reveal the depths of deception and the true nature of the crime that had claimed 2 young lives. As investigators delved deeper into the mother's life, a complex and troubling picture began to emerge. Financial records revealed mounting debts, unpaid bills, and multiple loans taken out in her name. More alarmingly, she had recently purchased substantial life insurance policies on both children, with coverage that would pay out a significant sum in the event of their deaths. The timing of these policies coincided closely with her financial troubles, suggesting a motive that went far beyond simple neglect. Detectives began to piece together a narrative in which desperation and planning might have intersected, leading to the unthinkable. Neighbors and acquaintances painted a portrait of a woman living a double life. To the outside world, she appeared as a loving, albeit stressed, single mother, juggling the demands of work, childcare, and household responsibilities. She was polite, courteous, and often seen managing errands or playing with her children in the yard. Yet those closer to her spoke of erratic behavior, frequent mood swings, bursts of anger, and moments of extreme frustration with her children. In hindsight, these small glimpses of instability took on new significance. Investigators began to see patterns in her behavior that aligned with manipulation and calculated action rather than ordinary parental stress. The home itself became a source of evidence. Officers examined bedrooms, common areas, and the kitchen, noting signs of careful staging. Records of daily routines were incomplete or inconsistent, with gaps in the mother's story about where she had been and what she had been doing at key times. Items in the house appeared deliberately placed to reinforce a narrative of normalcy, while subtle clues suggested attempts to hide planning or forethought. The detectives cataloged these details meticulously, knowing that small, overlooked elements often became crucial in cases involving deliberate deception. Interviews with friends and extended family added further layers to the investigation. Several people recalled conversations in which the mother expressed frustration over the challenges of raising children alone, sometimes speaking darkly about her desire for freedom from responsibility. While such remarks alone were not proof of criminal intent, combined with financial motives and the physical evidence surrounding the children's deaths, they heightened suspicion. Detectives began to consider the possibility that the car scene had been carefully staged, a narrative crafted to appear as a tragic accident while masking a calculated act of violence. Every piece of evidence pointed toward a grim conclusion. This was not a simple lapse in judgment. The combination of financial desperation, behavioral patterns, and forensic inconsistencies suggested premeditation. Detectives reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced witness statements, and continued to examine the mother's communications, searching for the smallest slip or admission that could confirm their suspicions. Each new discovery intensified the sense of betrayal and horror. The narrative of a caring parent tragically forgetting her children was crumbling, replaced by a far more disturbing reality. What had initially appeared to be a horrific accident was now increasingly recognized as a meticulously orchestrated act, raising profound questions about motive, opportunity, and the depths of human calculation. The moment police confronted the mother with the mounting evidence, the atmosphere shifted from investigative tension to outright confrontation. Detectives laid out the inconsistencies in her story, the toxicology results from the autopsy, and the financial motives that had surfaced during the investigation. The staged car scene, once believed to be a tragic accident, was now presented as part of a calculated plan. Every detail, from the unlocked doors to the positioning of the children in the back seat, was methodically explained, leaving little room for plausible deniability. The mother's demeanor shifted as she realized the weight of the evidence against her. The tears and frantic sobbing of the first hours gave way to a tense silence, a calculated attempt to maintain composure while her world closed in around her. Prosecutors quickly built a case that emphasized premeditation and deception. They highlighted how she had obtained substantial life insurance policies on her children in the months leading up to their deaths, portraying them as clear evidence of financial motive. They detailed her repeated contradictions, the gaps in her timeline, and the deliberate staging of the car scene, illustrating how these elements pointed to a meticulously planned act rather than an accidental lapse in judgment. Witness testimonies about her behavioral patterns, her occasional dark remarks about the burdens of parenting, and her erratic actions in the days before the tragedy were woven into the narrative, presenting a portrait of someone who had carefully masked intent behind the veneer of ordinary domestic life. The trial captivated the public and the local community. Media outlets covered every development, emphasizing the shocking nature of a mother who had appeared caring, yet may have orchestrated her children's deaths. Experts in forensic science and criminal behavior were brought in to explain the significance of the toxicology results, the bruising, and the inconsistencies in the staged scene. Psychological profiles painted her as someone capable of extreme calculation, blending emotional manipulation with the cold pragmatism necessary to attempt such a crime. Every detail added to the growing sense of horror, illustrating how the truth of the case diverged so drastically from initial perceptions. Throughout the trial, the weight of evidence left little room for doubt. The prosecution's case was compelling, grounded in forensic science, witness accounts, and documented financial incentives. The mother's defense struggled to counter the overwhelming trail of contradictions and material evidence. Experts testified to the improbability that the children could have died in the car as claimed, reinforcing the conclusion that the scene had been staged. Attempts to portray her as an overwhelmed parent were undermined by the cumulative weight of the inconsistencies, financial motive, and behavioral patterns. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that reflected the gravity of the evidence presented. She was found guilty on all counts, a conviction that underscored the deliberate and calculated nature of her actions. The courtroom was filled with a mix of relief, disbelief, and sorrow as the sentence was pronounced. What had initially been reported as a tragic case of children left in a hot car was revealed to be a horrifying story of betrayal, calculation, and the depths of human deception. The investigation, painstakingly conducted by detectives, revealed how appearances could be manipulated and how the truth, no matter how carefully concealed, would ultimately surface.